Good afternoon, Mr. Redfern. I think we're ready to resume.
Thank you, my lord. Good afternoon, Mr. Redfern.
Good afternoon.
We had reached the point of the decant, and I'm going to ask you in a minute some questions around life in Ward 6A in 2019. But before we get there, I want to ask you some questions about issues that were identified in relation to Ward 2A in the later part of 2018. You've got some evidence in your statement about that, and it might be helpful for you just to cast your mind, or rather refresh your memory as regards what your statement says. And I wonder if we could go to the bundles, the statements bundle, sorry, Mrs. Soshka, and if we go please to page 392, and I just have you look at paragraph 97.
Yep.
And under the heading Work in Ward 2A, 2B or HC, you say at this time, in other words, autumn 2018, at this time we were informed by the new Director of Facilities that as the ward had been decanted, there was an opportunity for the replacement of a new ventilation system to be implemented in Ward 2A, 2B, and that this would be progressing while we were on decant. See that?
Yes.
And what do you mean there was an opportunity?
That's how it was described to me. That there was any opportunity, or maybe opportunity is the wrong word. To all intents and purposes, we get told they were taking the vacation of the ward to put a new ventilation system in.
Yeah, when you say you may be choosing the wrong word, did somebody say there is an opportunity?
Top Steel said to me that they were putting a new ventilation system.
Did he say there's an opportunity has arisen to do this?
I can't remember his exact words.
But I'm just curious about your choice of word, and I wonder if we might just look at that. I wonder if we might look at something that might help you a bit with that. I wonder if we could have bundle 5 in front of Mr. Redfern, please. And it's at page 157. Now, this appears to be a media statement of December 6, 2018. Can you recall whether this is something that you've seen before?
I would have assumed I've seen it, yes.
Yeah. At the time?
Yes.
Yeah.
I can remember specifically Tom Steele telling me that they were doing this.
Okay. So if we just work our way through, it says, our engineering experts have now completed work to resolve the water and drainage issues in the 2 paediatric cancer wards at the Royal Hospital for Children. Let's pass over the next 2 paragraphs, Mr. Redfern, and it says, following this work, we have decided to upgrade the ventilation system in this area. And it goes on to say that this will cost £1.25 million, and there's a reference to a 12-month programme. You see all of that?
Yes.
It then says, Kevin Hill, RHC Hospital Director, said, as our patients and staff had already relocated to another ward, this provided a good opportunity to carry out this upgrading of the system. We have informed patients, their families and our staff about the plans for the ward, and I am grateful for their understanding. It says, while the BMT unit has already had a ventilation upgrade, its proximity to Ward 2A means that the best option is for those patients also to remain in the adult hospital until all work is completed. And there's then a background note. And if you look at the paragraph, it refers to the drains. You see the reference to this allowed our technical staff to carry out remedial works and to make investigations into the whole environment. You see that?
Yes.
It then says, it was during this period that our teams identified the opportunity to upgrade the ventilation system, and the work is now being progressed. And then if you go over the page, there's a question. Has the current ventilation system been causing risk to patients since the hospital opened? We regularly monitor infection rates, and the trigger for the work that has taken place over recent months on the water supply and drainage was a rise in the presence of bacteria and a number of infections above the rate we would normally expect in this cohort of patients. The ventilation work is not linked to infections, but is an opportunity to install the very highest standards currently achievable. You see all of that? And
Yes.
you say that you have a recollection
I do.
of seeing that at the time. Is that right?
Yes.
And I wonder whether it was the use of the word opportunity in that statement that perhaps led you to say what you said in your statement.
I never drafted my statement on the basis of that document. So that wasn't how I came up with the word opportunity. Probably, though, is how it was presented at the time to me, and what my memory is that the ward was vacant and there was a decision that I was told, A, we're going to replace the ventilation system, B, you're going to have the most modern ventilation system in paediatric healthcare, and C, it's going to extend the time that you're in Ward 6A.
Can you remember whether, going back to A of that list, whether there was an explanation for why the ventilation system was going to have work done to it?
Just that they were modernising it.
Okay. I wonder if the witness...
Sorry, my fault for not hearing why they were doing it. Your answer is to
They were modernising.
modernising it. Okay, thank you.
What was sold to everybody was the fact that they were saying you're going to have the most state-of-the-art ventilation system, and I think everybody was very happy about that.
That's what you were going to end up with.
Yes.
What I'm interested in is what you had at the minute. What was being said?
There was never the IMTs that I was involved in that triggered the move to Ward 6A never had anything around never specifically had anything around the ventilation system. It was a byproduct. It was not a byproduct. It was mentioned to me in the course of an IMT where we were talking about the length of duration in Ward 6A that I was told prepare for it being longer because we're going to replace the ventilation system, and that was what was articulated to me at the time.
And who articulated that to you?
Bob Steele.
And can you remember whether it was articulated on the basis that it was something that had to be done, or whether it was just an option to do it?
I'd say it was articulated to me that it was the latter.
It was just an option to do it. It didn't need to be done.
That was my recollection of it.
Okay. I wonder if we could have a look, please, at something on Bundle 4, please. And it's at page 132. Now, we've got an S-bar here. We've had an explanation of what an S-bar is. And that seems to be an S-bar that's gone from one person in estates to another, is that right?
Yes, from the S-bar it's Ian Powrie to Tom Steele, Deputy General Manager of Estates, to the Director of Facilities, which incorporates estates.
Okay. And if we look at the section next to situation, and maybe enlarge that slightly so everybody can see it properly. Thank you, Mrs. Soshka. Single bed accommodation has a nominal air change rate of 2.5 air changes per hour, with the single rooms being neutral to negative pressure relative to the ward corridor. This, combined with the potential risk of air recycling from ensuite WCs, the supply airstream via air passing through bypassing the thermal wheel heat recovery unit introduce a potential for cross-contamination between single room suites. You see all that?
Yes.
Can you have a recollection of either seeing that document or being told anything of that nature at the time?
No. Reading that doesn't. I mean, it sounds like there was a potential risk, but I wouldn't understand the wording of that.
I'm sorry, say that again. I didn't hear
I
you.
wouldn't understand the wording of that, even reading it just now. It's engineers.
But you do understand the wording, a potential risk.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's.
And are you indicating to us that you are at least able to read that as indicating a potential risk? Is that right?
Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah. Well, yeah, you agree with.
Yes.
Yeah. Now, maybe just to help a little further on this, I wonder if we could go to bundle 1, please. And it's page 227, sorry. Thank you. There's an IMT of the 13th of November 2018. And you seem to have been at it, is that right?
Yes, I'm listening.
Yeah. Now, if we go over the page to page 228, and if we enlarge the paragraph that begins an external review, and if you could just read that paragraph and then indicate to me once you've done that.
Yes, I read it.
Yeah. Do you have a recollection of that discussion?
I don't have a recollection of the discussion between Ian Powrie and Dr. Inkster. I do have I go back to the point. I do have a recollection that I was informed that the ventilation system was being replaced and that this would have an extended decant in the time. I can't remember what has been relayed here, which might be prompting for that decision to be made.
Well, just if we just take this in stages, we looked at these documents last week with Doctors Murphy and Professor Gibson, and of the issue that's raised here about the IMT about pressure. Professor Gibson explained that her understanding would be the risk in not having positive pressure would be that material could get into a patient's room. Is that something that you would understand?
Yes.
Yeah. And in relation to these documents, Dr. Murphy said, looking at the S-bar, his understanding would be that the ventilation system was deemed not fit for purpose. Now, can you recall whether that's what you understood the position to be at the time?
That was never articulated to me that the ventilation system was not fit for purpose.
Okay. Can you recall whether what was being said was that the ventilation system required to be remediated or upgraded?
Well, I was assumed that if we were upgrading the ventilation system, there would be reasons for why we were doing that as an
What I'm pressing you on, if I may, Mr. Redfern, is do you remember in the discussion at the IMT and in your understanding of this matter at the time that this was something that required to be done?
I don't recall that being mentioned at the IMT.
Well, I am doing the best you can today. Was it or was it not a requirement, or was it just something that was nice to have?
I worked on the premise that I don't think it was just that it was nice to have. I think that is a bit unfair to say, but I do not recall saying that it ever been mentioned that the ventilation system had to be taken out and replaced.
I didn't say that. The question I'm asking you is whether the advice at the time was that there was a requirement to do work.
I don't recall that being said, that there was a requirement.
So is your recollection then that this was only ever said in the manner of there's an opportunity that has arisen to upgrade?
That's my recollection, and the fact that, as I said, there would be an extension in our stay within Ward 6A, and the decision had been taken to do it.
Okay. The reason I'm asking you this is that the reason I'm interested in the similarity between the choice of word in your witness statement and in the media briefing is that there was evidence from the patient and family witness group that the media briefing was effectively an exercise in spin and did not reflect the situation with the ventilation system at the time. How would you respond to that?
I couldn't comment for what the media statement was for the ventilation system in terms of spin, but I wouldn't think the organisation would be looking to do that.
Well, there's a quote from Mr. Hill, who was your boss at the time.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think what's being suggested, if I understand it, is that he put a more positive spin on things than was the true position. How do you respond to that?
I would say that there was a positive aspect of what was happening in that this was going to be a state-of-the-art ventilation system. What triggered it, as I've said, as what was relayed to myself, was that we were out of the ward, and they were taking the decision to replace the ventilation system. But I was never in the understanding that if we had been in the ward, we would have had to get out the ward to have the ventilation system replaced, if that makes my position
No, could you say that again, please? Sorry.
So the circumstances being that we were experiencing, we were out of the ward, yeah? So the ward's vacant and they were replacing the ventilation system. If we were in the ward and we hadn't had the water and nothing had been going on, there was no inclination to me up until that time and thereafter that we would need to get out the ward for the ventilation system to be replaced.
Okay, thank you. We'll move on shortly from this.
So I wasn't expecting to hear Tom Steele say at the time that we're going to replace the ventilation system.
Yeah, no, I understand the point. But what you did say when we looked at the SBAR is that you were able to read that as indicating identification of a risk. Is that right?
I think that's what it, from a non-engineering perspective, I think that's what it's saying.
Okay. If there's an identification of risk, can you say whether that would indicate that it would therefore be a requirement to address the risk?
I think from an engineering perspective, they would have to take that through that and what the degree of risk was.
Yeah.
Weighed against the implications.
If you just answer the question, please, Mr. Redfern, would you agree with me that if there's been identification of a risk, you, as a senior manager with responsibility for this group of patients and the clinicians, would recognise that as something that required to be addressed? Is that right?
I think yes.
Yeah, well, can I ask you again whether you think that the language that was used at the time about it being an opportunity to address the situation with the ventilation system was or was not a reasonable and fair assessment of things?
I think that from what you're saying and from the other information that you've presented, there could have maybe been something more specific around that. Yeah.
Well, something more accurate. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, yes.
Thank you. Now, if we move on, please, to Ward 6A and life in Ward 6A. Now, we've had quite a lot of evidence on this, Mr. Redfern, and I don't want to go over that unnecessarily. And I also want to say something to you which I hope gives you some reassurance about what we're about to cover and has been indicated to the other witnesses. We are obviously aware of certain very anxious patient cases that arose over that period of time. And I'm very nervous about you or I discussing anything that might intrude in relation to any issues of patient confidentiality. So if I reassure you that that's certainly not my intention, and if you and I just both try and tread quite warily, are you happy to proceed in that way?
Yes, I'm happy to do that.
Thank you. Now, if we, you have provided us with some evidence about life on Ward 6A, and I'm really just focusing on the early part of 2019. And I wonder if we might please just go to an IMT that you do deal with, but I just want to sort of tease out one or two aspects of it. It's in bundle 1, Mrs. Soshka, and it's at page 255. And once again, just in terms of identifying what this is, IMT of the 7th of January 2019, we see your name mentioned. And I think, as you say in your witness statement, this was one that you were at. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Now, I just wanted to identify one or two aspects of the discussion that will help us in creating our understanding of the narrative. And then I'm going to ask you a couple of questions about things that you are recorded as discussing. So if we could go, please, to page 256. And are you able to read that as it currently stands without it being enlarged?
The full page?
Well, I'll tell you why I ask, because I want you to have a look at the very top. First of all, can you read that? Air samples?
Yes, I can read that.
So heavy growth of fungus, but no cryptococcus. And then if you drop down the page underneath the sort of 2 paragraphs above hypothesis, still on page 256, please, Mrs. Soshka, sorry. You see just 2 paragraphs above hypothesis in 6A and 4C, do you see that?
Yes.
We would expect to see fungus on plates as they're not HEPA-filtered wards. However, 6A seems significantly heavier fungal growth than 4C, the reason for which is unclear. And we've already looked at least some of this, and I just wanted to have you give us your recollection of whether you recall that sort of thing being said at the time.
Yes, I recall it.
That's great, thank you. Now, I wonder if we can go over, please, to page 257. And if we look at the top paragraph and just enlarge that slightly. And if you just go 4 lines up from the bottom of that paragraph, you see parents continue to ask questions.
Yes.
You got that? Again, we've had some evidence on this already, so it's just to get your perspective. They continue to ask questions about why their children are receiving prophylaxis, and BG, concerned that there was no formal statement from the board, she added that staff locally have provided a statement to the parents which was generated in conjunction with TI. You see that?
Yes.
And I'm just really asking you this question at this point. Do you have a recollection of a concern around an absence of communication of some kind from the board?
I can't specifically remember that, although I do remember that prophylaxis generally was an issue that was of concern to parents.
Okay, thank you. And if we go to the foot of the page, please, just above Hayat. JRE, that would be you, I take it.
Yes.
Summarise that the content of today's meeting has highlighted a risk for patients on Ward 6A. You see that?
Yes.
And was that your recollection was that your understanding at the time?
Yes, there was the obviously the commentary within the minute articulates the concerns that were there, both from clinicians and from, as you've described, parents around the use of prophylaxis, and that would be escalated up through the IMT process.
Yeah, thank you. And obviously, we understand that, and without going into it, that the concern around cryptococcus would be a part of that. But I think from what we've just seen, are we right in understanding that on Ward 6A itself, there were signs of heavy fungal growth that weren't cryptococcus, is that right?
Yes, that's what it's saying in the minute.
Yeah. So are we to understand then, as far as you recall, was it your recollection that that of itself was a concern?
Yes, that we wouldn't have been having an IMT if there wasn't a concern.
Yeah, thank you. And if we go over the page, please, to page 258. And if we enlarge the paragraph under press, now, I think I just want to give you the opportunity to read that paragraph, and then once again, if you let me know once you've done that.
Yes, I've read it.
Thank you. And can you confirm whether you have a recollection of seeing what's more or less recorded there?
Yes.
Thank you. So I wonder if you can maybe just help us understand what it was that you were seeking to articulate.
So Dr. Inkster was indicating that ideally, obviously, the decant of patients from a paediatric hemato-oncology ward would go into something that replicated the infrastructure they should have, and that I think the West of Scotland CC is was referring to the Beatson, but the Beatson was discounted for primarily two reasons, one of which was, as mentioned here, the adjacencies to paediatric services, and we went through that process earlier. And described why we reached 6A. The second part, and I've articulated that by saying that we went through that process of why we chose 6A, and that was done with full clinical engagement and the limitations that we had for any of the options. Mm-hmm. The second, or the closing lines, are the reality of the situation, which was we thought we would be able to manage that decant within a shorter period of time than what we were faced with the extended work that was then getting carried out.
Okay. There's a couple of things I want to pick up from that. The first is something that you've already told us a bit about already. You say there was an extensive risk assessment. Again, just to go back to the evidence you gave earlier, we're right in understanding it wasn't you personally who did that risk assessment.
No, it was a multidisciplinary. Sorry, are you talking about the risk assessment around what choice we made, or the risk assessment and the suitability of 6A?
Are those different things?
Well, I'm articulating that position because obviously Dr. Inkster has indicated that there was an infection control preference, that there was a move to a potential site within NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde, which was had a more improved infrastructure for the management of this type of patient, but it was ruled out because of other clinical consequences and disadvantages to them, and I think that was an appropriate decision to take. In terms of Ward 6A, I think I've articulated, and it's been articulated minutes earlier that we've discussed, that it was not built as a paediatric hemato-oncology unit, no matter what modifications we made to it, and that ideally we would have had a shorter period of time, but that unexpected occurrence was that was going to be longer than what we thought. And as part of this IMT, what we would have been looking to do is put further solutions in place to mitigate against any risk as a result of that. and around communication, how we would present that.
Okay, I just want to go back to what I took you to say at the start of that when you asked me to clarify
Sorry.
my question. And so I'm going to respond with my own question. Was there more than one risk assessment? Was there a risk assessment about that was specific to, sorry, let me take a step back and make this easier to understand. At the point in September 2018, when the requirement to decant had been identified, and there were a variety of options being looked at, were each of those the subject of a risk assessment?
There wasn't a formal risk assessment against each of those.
Sorry,
there wasn't a formal risk assessment done against each. It was more an option, almost an option appraisal against what was practical given the criteria that we set. So if you wanted to go through each of what those options were, the criteria was clear and apparent. And the only solution, and as far as I'm concerned, still the only solution, which was agreed by the clinical community and all others present through that process, was that we decanted to an area within the adult hospital.
And when you refer to the options appraisal, are you referring to the options appraisal that you prepared?
Yes.
Right. So are you saying to us that there was not any risk assessment of each of the options beyond that?
Not that I recall, because physically we were of the view that the size was limited. Well, first of all, we couldn't decant into the children's hospital because of the sinks that I've mentioned. We didn't have an identified area where we could remedy the problem that we were experiencing in 2A. We couldn't move to the Beatson because of the transfer backwards and forwards of patients and the implications for them, given that hemato-oncology patients will often require ITU stay, will often require theatre, will often require access to radiology and other facilities. And we've already discussed the modular build, therefore, and the relocation of patients to another hemato-oncology unit in Scotland was not possible because none were big enough, and the natural option, therefore, based on all of that observation, and hopefully pretty transparent, was that it would have to be in the Queen Elizabeth.
Okay. So if we just, again, try and take this in stages, I just want to be sure I understand this. The options back in September that were under consideration were the Beatson, the adult hospital, a modular unit, or another hospital out with GGC.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes.
And what you've said a moment ago is that there was no risk assessment that was done in relation to all of those options. Is that right?
There was no formal risk assessment because there was a time imperative to get this agreed and get a solution in place. And I think from how I've described it, or I hope from how I've described it, it was pretty apparent that why we would reject certain of those options. And as I've said, those present, full clinical community, full infection prevention control and others recognised that the best option within that set of circumstances and for an early decant to resolve the problem was to move to the Queen Elizabeth and find a space or a dedicated space there. There was also the protection of the bone marrow transplant service, which again was close proximity to the location of the Queen Elizabeth and the use of space freed up within Ward 4B.
Okay, if we just take then of the options, the particular option to go to the adult hospital, was there or was there not a risk assessment done of that?
Of Ward 6A?
Yes.
I can't comment on well, there was a formal risk assessment in terms of what we had to do prior to moving in and changes that we had to make to the infrastructure within Ward 6A. There was obvious infection control and estate involvement in terms of the fact that this was not, as I've said before, a paediatric hemato-oncology unit. But given the circumstances of what we faced, we would have to move in there. So I think we prepared Ward 6A as best as we could within the situation faced, and we went through a number of actions to do that. And we implemented it in a safe and effective way, that transfer, once the decision was made. Whether we had went to a different ward within the Queen Elizabeth, we couldn't use Ward 4B in its entirety because it wasn't big enough. So it's an 18-bedded ward. We needed significantly more space than that. And we needed a ward that was physically adjacent to Ward 4B because we were disaggregating our staff to manage a caseload that normally would be in the same ward over two separate wards. And therefore, we wanted them as close as we possibly could come to. And through that process, Ward 6A was identified as the location of choice.
Okay, I'll ask my question again. Was there or was there not, in choosing whether to go towards 6A, was there, or if you just let me ask the question, was there or was there not a risk assessment as to whether that would be a safe option?
So I would say yes, that was that what I've just described was the risk assessment.
Okay, and I mean, you did give some evidence on this earlier. I just want to be sure I understand it. And can you remind us, please, who it was that was responsible for doing that risk assessment?
It was a combination of infection control, service, the clinical team and management of the directorate and the states.
Well, I think the clinical team, having heard them last week, would certainly take umbrage at the suggestion that they were involved in risk assessing whether it was safe to go towards 6A. So how would you respond to that?
I would say they were part of the decision making that we were involved in how we reached that choice.
I think you know what I'm asking, Mr. Redfern. I'm asking who was it assessed whether or not it would be safe to go towards 6A?
The combination of those groups that I've mentioned ultimately would have been reached through that process and through subsequent IMTs.
Okay, and maybe we can approach it this way. Will there be a paper trail that demonstrates that?
I would assume there is, yeah.
Well, did you see one at the time?
The decision making around the move and the suitability towards 6A, there would be an audit trail of that as per what I've just discussed, what I've just described.
When you prepared your options appraisal, did you have documented risk assessments that you could use to inform your advice?
They came thereafter when we were looking at the infrastructure within Ward 6A.
So after the decision was taken to move to 6A?
I didn't know it was going to be Ward 6A when we ran the option appraisal. We just knew it was going to be a ward within the Queen Elizabeth and finding physical space that could allow for that move to happen.
Okay, well, I think we'll move on. But just staying with the entry, paragraph 258, the other thing I was going to ask you about is, you say, it says in the minute that you queried whether we were robust enough in our decision. Do you recall saying that?
It's in the minute, so I must have said it.
And are you able to help us with what that means?
So we were in an IMT, and again, we were looking at whether or not our assumptions in moving towards 6A were robust. I think that's pretty self-explanatory in what it's saying there. Ideally, we would have been in Ward 6A for a short period of time, and we would not have been in an IMT.
Well, it might be thought to indicate that you were querying whether they were robust enough.
Well, as I said, we were in an IMT, so were our assumptions correct in terms of Ward 6A's suitability?
Okay. If we move on, please, I want to take us to another IMT a little later in the month. It's the 16th of January, and it's still in Bundle 1, it's page 261. Again, it's something we've had some evidence on, but I don't think we actually looked at the minute. So if you don't mind, just so that we get to see this. Again, I think we see it's a meeting of the 16th of January, and I think we do see that you were present. Is that right? The right-hand side?
Yes,
Yeah.
I'll say it.
And I'll just draw you, if we could scroll down a little on this page, please, Mrs. Soshka, and just pausing underneath the purpose of today's meeting, there's the reference to Cryptococcus albidus. Do you see that?
Yes.
And if we go down the page, please, to current risk to patients. TI explained that this strain of Cryptococcus is less pathogenic, but still a risk in hemato-oncology patients. Do you see that?
Yes.
And can you say whether you have a recollection of that being Dr. Inkster's advice at that time?
Yes, I think that she felt that Cryptococcus was a risk to haematology oncology patients.
Yeah.
Clinically.
And that it was being reported that there was Cryptococcus, albeit of the species albidus, that was found in the ward. Was that your understanding?
That's what it says.
Right. Okay, and if we go, please, to over the page, I just want to sort of pick up on something that might be relevant to communications in this period. It's page 262. And if we go down scroll down the page a little, please. And the paragraph that begins comms, if we can enlarge that. JRE informed the group that a number of parents went to the Scottish Government on Sunday with concerns relating to the communications from the IMT, particularly those provided to outpatient hemato-oncology population. Do you have a recollection of that being discussed?
I do.
Yeah, are you able to help us a bit with what that's about?
So I think that was about the communication initially, which had focused on the inpatients at any particular time, and that we had to widen it to a much broader group of hemato-oncology patients. And I can't specifically remember the timelines, but around that and the interactions with Scottish Government, I think was when we started to look at communication as part of the overall process we were in.
Yeah, I mean, just sort of pausing there and taking a step back, thinking about your general evidence about communication that you give in your statement. Do you recall that there continued to be concerns around the way in which the organisation was communicating with patients and families?
Up to that time?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so, because there were parents that obviously had went and met with Scottish Government and expressed that.
Okay. And if we go on a bit, please, in time, I wonder if you can help us with a detail from this time, and it's page 274 in this bundle. And I think again we see it's an IMT that you're present at.
Yeah.
And all I want you to do is help us with one reference if you're able to. You may not be able to, but if you go to page 276. Under the heading Press, some members of this group may not all agree with the press statement, but not everyone across the multidisciplinary colleagues who attend the IMTs will. So it is about getting the balance correct. You see that?
Yes.
Now, I've got, again, two questions. One, do you have a recollection of a discussion of that nature? And two, are you able to help us with what that's about?
I don't have a specific reference to remembering that particular line, but I do know that in IMTs there would be different views often articulated. And that may be a situation that would have prompted that, and that we would need to take a balance based on the different views.
Okay. But just to be clear, you yourself don't have a clear recollection of what that's about?
not that specific issue there, but I have experience within IMTs where there will be different views between estates, between microbiology, infection control, in particular. There will be there would be differences of view, or the clinical team. That would be a natural position, I think, around when you were working through hypotheses and the solutions there.
I will emphasise that I do not claim an encyclopedic knowledge of all of these IMTs in framing the question I'm about to frame. But I certainly don't recall an observation like that being flagged in any of the other ones that I've seen. And I'm just wondering whether you have a recollection of there being a concern around a press statement around that.
I don't have a recollection of that press statement.
Thank you. Now, we know from the evidence that we can put that to one side, thank you. We know from evidence that we've already had, Mr. Redfern, that there was a decant of the patient group from 6A back to the Children's Hospital to the CDU, is that right?
Yes.
And I think we understand that to have happened between the 22nd of January and the 8th of February 2019. Would that chime with your recollection?
Yes.
What was the reason for that, as far as you recall?
There was hopefully I will get the correct days as not dates. There was an incident identified on the Friday evening with some mould in the ward in a particular area, and some estate work was being carried out around the investigation of that. And it was felt that that could be contained through the scribe and work that would be done to remedy it. When that work was carried out by the Saturday morning, I got a phone call from Dr. Linkster saying that as they had investigated the area in more detail, they had found more mould than they'd expected, and that our view was, for the safety of patients, a cohort in that vicinity would have to be moved, and would therefore have to be moved to the Children's Hospital. As a result of that further work, and also trying to protect the service on the basis of not fragmenting it across a whole range of different areas, an area had to be identified, and CDU was identified.
In the Children's Hospital?
Yes.
A couple of points on that. Mr. Redfern, do you have a recollection of the extent of the problem as reported by Dr. Inkster or anybody else?
I would say the extent was quite significant, enough for us to carry out the actions that we did, enough for me to come in the Saturday, and enough for me, Professor Gibson and Dr. Inkster to late into Saturday evening walk right across the hospital to all hemato-oncology families, explaining to them what was happening and how we were going to take this matter forward.
Yeah. Maybe just to help you and help us understand the extent of it, if we go, please, in Bundle 1 to page 291. There's an IMT of the 25th of January 2019 at which you are present, is that right?
Sorry, yes.
And if we go on, please, to page 2, forgive me, if we go on page 292, and under Ward 6A update, Dr. Inkster and Dr. Hood did a walk round of Ward 6A. They met the contractor in charge of the shower work, who informed her that 80% of the showers were affected by mould. Does that accord with your recollection of how extensive it was?
Yes, it was. As we carried out more exploratory work around what the problem was, we identified a bigger problem than we'd first envisaged. So, as I said, on the Friday night, we thought we could contain that within a scribe and a piece of work. But as we carried that out, Dr. Inkster, well, it was played for him to look at. We had identified that there was more mould than what we had first anticipated.
Yeah. And I think I possibly indicated that I had another question I was going to ask in relation to this stage of matters. The move back to the Children's Hospital, did that give rise to any particular concern on your part?
It was a very difficult set of circumstances. Families obviously had been through the move from the hospital to 6A and were now going back. I think there was an uncomfortableness about the whole environment within the campus, and I had to, along with the clinical team, manage that as best we could and reassure, primarily with the purpose not for families to take children out of the hospital while they were under the care of hemato-oncology, the hemato-oncology service.
Yeah. And just thinking back to...
And that was why we did the walkabout round every day, speaking to everybody, explaining to them what was the cause, how we were going to manage it, and how we were going to try and protect in a safe clinical environment.
Okay. Just thinking back to the reference that we saw in the IMTs from September 2018 about a perception that it wouldn't be safe to have the children in the Children's Hospital at that time. Was the prospect of moving them to the CDU something that concerned you?
In terms of moving from 6A to CDU,
Yeah.
It wasn't an ideal set of circumstances, both for how we used CDU at the time, which was part of our emergency plan during that period in the winter, and it was obviously not ideal to move the hemato-oncology patients again, but it was a necessary action we had to take. So these were not ideal situations, but we had to operate on the best information we had available. Nobody moved into 6A thinking that there was going to be the mould that we had found in that environment at that time, and that what we had to do was similar to what we had to do in September, was have as robust a process in place that protected those families and children as much as we possibly could, given the circumstances we had.
What was your assessment of the impact of all of this, all of the events that you've been describing, culminating in this decant to the CDU? What was your assessment of the impact of that upon patients and families?
It was very challenging. The natural position would be, I think, for anybody to take was, we've moved from A to B, we're now moving from B back to A, and when will we ever get this right? And I think that would be something that I had to best manage as much as I could with Dr. Inkster and the clinical team.
Yeah.
But I can understand why families felt how they felt.
And what about as far as the staff were concerned?
Again, yes. There was a confidence. The natural impact of that will be a confidence in the environment that we have within the campus, yeah. I would assume.
As we move a little further into 2019, into the summer of 2019, when I asked, I put to Professor Gibson evidence that had been given by the patients and families that they were at breaking point at that stage, and she responded that she accepted that, but that staff were at breaking point as well. Would that be how you saw matters?
I don't know whether I would use the words at breaking point, but we were trying to manage staff morale and the fact that we were in another detailed IMT, and around that time we were actually making pretty big decisions, which I'm sure you'll come on to in your questioning to me, that would not have made, it just was not an ideal set of circumstances to be faced with. So I could see the challenges both for parents and families, and also for staff.
Yeah. Well, let's move a little further into 2019. Now, we've had quite a bit of evidence that has set out the narrative of what happened from the perception of the clinicians and the concern that they had around the return of, as they saw it, and as Dr. Ringster saw it, unusual infections, and how that then played out over the next weeks and months until, let me pause, including effectively a restriction on Ward 6A for new patients and then the reopening of it. Now, I'm not proposing to ask you anything in particular about that because we've got your position in your statement and we've had all of that evidence. There is one aspect of that stage that I would like to clarify with you though, and that's about your involvement in relation to a particular matter, and that was communication around cases of Mycobacterium coloni. Okay? Now, I want to begin with some context, and I'll put some context to you and ask you to say whether or not you accept this context. An IMT from 2018, which we did actually look at briefly, indicates one or perhaps two cases of Mycobacterium coloni being identified among patients and reported to an INT at which you were present. Do you have a recollection of that?
Yes.
Yeah. Now, we've had evidence from the patient's father, and also we have statement evidence from the treating clinician that they had wished for the water to be sampled and tested, but this was not done. Do you have a recollection of that?
And sorry, what time period are you talking about? 2019 or
2018.
I don't have a formal recollection of that.
And we have evidence in statement form from the treating clinician that the 2018 patient had mainly been in a hospital prior to contracting their infection, and that the treating clinician believed the source of the infection to be environmental. Now, is that something that you have any recollection of?
I have a recollection of meeting with the parent we're talking about. I have a recollection that there was an unhappiness that the case was not included in the cases that were considered core to the IMT at that time, but it was classed as a case of interest. I have a recollection that Professor Inkster explained why that was, and it was a technical issue around the definitions and working practices of an IMT, which she referred to. But I also have a recollection that Professor Inkster carried out investigations thereafter around that particular case, and hence why it was a case of interest.
Thank you. And just to be clear, you're talking about discussions in 2018, I assume?
I can't remember the timelines of what year it was, but it would have been around then, I think.
Yeah, okay.
I do remember the parent being extremely unhappy that his child was not classed as part of the core IMT caseload, but as a case of interest.
Okay. Now, there's just, again, I'm just trying to set the context, and the understanding that we have is that the events that I've just been describing took place in 2018. And there's a couple of other aspects to that context. I just want to ask you whether you recall, do you have a recollection of whether you agreed to be, as it were, a single point of contact for this?
I did.
For the patient's father, is that right?
Yes.
And do you have a recollection of, again, forgetting events in 2019, we'll come to those, do you have a recollection of whether there were further discussions in the later part of 2018 between him and you regarding the question of whether the hospital was safe, and in which he highlighted concerns about the possibility of further cases of Mycobacterium coloni?
I can't. I think that my recollection is that there were concerns around the safety of the hospital environment, and that ranged from a variety of different things, from from the infections that were occurring to the wider infrastructure in the hospital, the glass falling off the building, or whatever other sort of unfortunate occurrence had happened in the campus. I cannot remember him specifically saying that there was a whole host or potential of other cases, although he was unhappy with how that particular infection was being treated, as I said, as a case of interest. But my understanding was that Dr. Inkster, although it was classified as a case of interest, did carry out further investigation into that. And as you know, subsequent to that, a second case was query identified.
We'll come on to that in a minute. I think it's important that we don't conflate things. All I was really asking is, and I'll just clarify my question, the understanding, or rather the suggestion that's been put to me, is that there may have been a conversation with you in which the patient's father, and this is in late 2018, raised a concern about the possibility that there would be further cases of Mycobacterium.
I think he did raise that concern.
Now, I want to move to the summer of 2019. And what I'm going to try and do in a minute is get an understanding of your recollection of events. And I want to try and do this in a way that is easiest for us all to follow. So what I want to do at the start is really just to understand the nature of any investigations that you have made about what went on in the summer of 2019 in relation to communication with this particular family, the 2018 family.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm only interested in that in a minute, and I'm going to ask you some questions about that. In a little while, I'm going to look at an email that you wrote to, and we're going to have to name the patient's father, Professor Cudahy.
Yes, I know who I'm talking about.
Yeah. In a while, I'm going to ask you to look at an email that you wrote to him after he'd expressed his unhappiness. And you said that you had made inquiry with, quotes, senior colleagues. You know the email I'm talking about?
Yes, I think so, yes.
Yeah. And we also know that Professor Cudahy subsequently raised concerns with the chairman and with the chief executive about communication over that piece. Is that right?
I wasn't party to the direct communications that Professor Cudahy had, but I can make the observation that happened.
Yeah, thank you. And again, and it's helpful that you do confine your answers in the way that you just did. I just want to understand what you understand.
I fully understand the circumstances to this situation.
Yeah, and I think you're aware that he gave evidence to the inquiry in October 2021 and expressed grave concerns about what he saw as a failure by the board, by the organisation, in its duty of candour to a patient. Do you understand that?
Yes, I understand the situation, yes.
Now, at the time, in 2019, were you still the general manager for paediatrics?
Yes.
And you're now director of Women and Children's Director, is that right? Yeah. And as we've established, you are aware that one of the patients and families makes, as he sees it, a grave allegation of a failure by the organisation in its duty of candour. So thinking about what you said in your email about speaking with senior colleagues and thinking about all of the profile that this matter has had, and thinking about the senior position that you adopt that you have in the organisation, what investigations have you made prior to today as regards what actually happened over this period of time?
So I think, can I explain the context of how we got here? Because I think it's helpful in terms of answering your...
If we just take a step back, I will take you through all of this.
Okay.
I just simply want to know, have you made investigations as to the issue around the allegation of an absence of candour arose?
I have not formally asked for an investigation from the board chief exec or the chairman. I didn't think that was my place to do that, given the circumstances I'm going to describe around this.
Okay, well, we'll just go through it in detail then. So if we begin, please, by going to the bundle of IMTs, and we go to page 320 of bundle 1, please. Now, this is a IMT which you are not present, I think, Mr. Redfern. The 19th of June, 2019. Is that right?
Yeah, I can't see my name on there.
No. And if we go over the page to page 321, you see the heading atypical mycobacteria. You see that?
Yes.
And if you just take a moment to look at that paragraph.
Yes.
Okay, so I think with the key points maybe be that the IMT had been alerted to a case of Mycobacterium coloni. Is that right?
Yes. Yes. The reference here was, as I said, that at the time when we had earlier looked at why it was considered, the first case was considered a case of interest because there was only one case, and Dr. Inkster had explained to the parent the process it would fall under such circumstance and why she was classifying that as that. This articulates that a second case came, goes back to the point that you're saying that said parent thought that there was a risk that a second case or a third case could occur, and at this point in time that is suggesting that a second case did occur.
Yeah, and I think Dr. Inkster seems to be indicating that
her position would change in terms of the way she was treating the original case to this case.
Yeah, well, we'll come on to that in a minute, but if we just
stay,
it's quite difficult, especially with the redaction. So but as far as the 29, if we call it the 2019 case, as far as the 2019 case is concerned, in the context of a discussion of that, I think she's saying that Mycobacterium coloni has been isolated from sampling on 6A, is that right?
Yes.
Yeah, and
yes.
I think maybe this is the point that you're making. She's now saying
she's changing her position.
Yeah, 2 years, two in 1
Yes.
year is data exceedance, is that right?
She's changing her position.
Yeah, yeah. And there's to be a timeline done on the recent case, is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. Now, again,
as there would, because it's a case of reference to the IMT.
Yeah. And in the redacted section, I can tell you that there's an indication that there's to be a review of the previous case. And I mean, you've obviously looked at this matter before. And can you say whether that accords with your recollection?
My understanding was that there already had, as I've said, Dr. Inkster had went, based on the meeting we'd had with the parent, Dr. Inkster had carried out earlier work on that particular case, but then reinforced it with further work.
Yeah.
which I think is entirely appropriate on the basis of what is mentioned in the immediate minute.
Thank you. That is exactly in line with what's underneath the redaction, that there was going to be further investigation because of this. Would that be your understanding?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think that is appropriate based on the reference to cases in 1 year considered to be a data exceedance.
Yeah. Okay. So if we go now, please, to page 323. And I'm looking at the communications section, just enlarged. Yeah, that's helpful. And I'm not interested in the reference to GNBs. It says of M. Coloni, further information to be gathered in respect to timeline and water testing. Comms will then be prepared for parents. It was agreed that parents of the current case would be spoken to by Professor Gibson on her return from leave next week. You see all of that?
Yes.
And I just notice a little further down under duty of candour, it says discussed under comms for patients/parents. Yeah?
Yes.
I appreciate you weren't there, but I'm assuming this is an IMT minute that you will have seen before.
Yes.
Yeah. Are you able to help us with what, if anything, we take from the reference to duty of candour?
That the patient who was part of the IMT, as I've described before, should be given all full reference to the fact that their child has an infection and what is happening to them as a result of that, and what may have caused that infection as being discussed at the IMT.
And that latter bit you would expect to be part of the discussion as well, is that what you're saying? With the patient, I mean.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm a bit surprised that it's Professor Gibson that is minuted as doing it, because my understanding was the patient came under Dr. Sastry, but if the minute says Professor Gibson.
I think this is why it's going to be quite important to go through this quite carefully. I think the reference to Professor Gibson is because Professor Gibson was involved with the 2019 patient. Dr. Sastry was involved with the 2018 patient. Does that help?
Right, sorry, yes, yeah, you're correct. Sorry, that's my mistake.
No, not at all. And in terms of that section on duty of candour, do we take anything from the fact that there's a reference to patients, plural?
Sorry, where are you again? Sorry, just so I'm clear.
Just where the cursor is, Mr. Redfern.
Yeah, yes, because I think that we were moving into the position that we should be having a discussion with both parents of case 1 and case 2.
Okay, that's helpful.
And I think that is entirely appropriate given what we've just described.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you very much. Now, could we go to bundle 8, please? I just want to try and walk us through the steps as we've seen them. And I emphasise as we've seen them. I absolutely acknowledge that there may be more bits of correspondence out there that we've not seen. So if we go to bundle 8, please, and go to page 68. Now, as ever with emails, you have to jump about slightly, but if we start at the top of the page, we see it's an email of the 19th of June to, among others, Jennifer Armstrong and you. And if we go over the page, we see it's from Dr. Inkster.
Yes.
You see that?
Yep.
And if we can take us back up towards the top of the page again. Presumed source is areas out with Ward 6A without filters on where patients may have been. And do you have a recollection of seeing that email at the time, or have you had cause to look at it since?
In terms of this overall episode that we're covering, it's not an email that I recall as being fresh in my mind, but I am copied into it and therefore would confirm that I have seen it and read it. That's
great. Thank you for that. It's really just to try and understand the chain of events. And if we move then to page 67 in this bundle, if we go to the foot of the page, that looks as if it's an email from you on the 19th of June forwarding Dr. Inkster's email. If you want to go over the page just to check that, we can do that.
No, I take it that's
Yeah.
what I've done.
And it then goes up to Mr. Dell, and we see there's a reference under 19th of June 2019, Mark Dell sitting with Jamie, and he passed this on. And then at the top of the page, there's emails involving Sandra Bastillo and Mark Dell. And Mr. Dell says, I've just spoke with Kevin. He's letting Jane and Jonathan know. Do you see all of that?
Yes.
Now, do you know what it was that he was letting Jane and Jonathan know about?
I can't be specific because I wasn't. I don't think I was copied into this email conversation, but I can make an assumption that it was we had a second case and that it was going to discussions that we had previously had and previously described around the fact that this would involve Professor Cudahy.
Okay, and just so we're all clear, Jane and Jonathan would be Jane Grant and Jonathan Best.
Yes.
Was it usual for the most senior members of the organisation to be alerted about individual infection cases?
Only through the IMT process.
Was it usual for that to happen?
Not for this email exchange, I
So
don't think.
what we're seeing here,
Well, I can only see what I ever see, so I don't know whether that has happened in the past or not, that I've not been privy to being copied into. But in terms of my expectation, I wouldn't necessarily have expected that to happen.
okay, thank you. Now, if we go please to bundle 1, to page 325. And again, just take a moment to satisfy yourself that that's an IMT of the 25th of June. And I think we see in the second line that you're present.
Yes.
Again, if you'll forgive me, what I want to do is pick up some of the details in the IMT, and then I'm going to ask you for your recollection of what happened, and hopefully that assists you in what you say. So if we go please to page 326. And I'm interested in the section that's underneath the heading M. coloni. And I'm interested in the second paragraph and the final 2 sentences. Now, in all fairness to you, Mr. Redfern, if you want to take the opportunity to read both paragraphs, that's absolutely fine by me. So do you want to do that?
Yes, I will.
Yeah. Thank you. Now, I mentioned that I'm interested in those last 2 sentences, and I think it's maybe just to ensure that we all understand what was being said. It says, Dr. Inkster informed the group that the incubation time for Mycobacterium coloni is 15 days to 8 weeks. This puts the second patient present in RHC theatres where they had their line manipulated. Does that indicate, well, would we be right in understanding that Dr. Inkster is indicating that the 2019 patient is being, no, let me ask you, what do you say that means?
I think if we're looking at why, if there was an environmental link to the infection that has been discussed at the IMT, then Dr. Inkster's timeline would suggest that that environmental link would be around the patient's activity within theatres and what was happening to them in theatres. But you would really need to speak to Dr. Inkster about anything further. I would be speaking completely out my education zone. And that's what my reading of that is.
Yeah, that's mine too, that effectively she's saying the timeline on this puts the patient...
What as part of an IMT process, what they will always do is look at a timeline of a patient and try and identify where the potential source of the infection has come from, if classed as environmental. And as a result of that, I think that's what she's saying there.
Yeah. So what she's saying is the timeline is putting this patient, as it were, out with 6A and in the RHC theatres at a time that would match the incubation period for the...
I think that's
infection.
what she's saying, yes.
Yeah. Now, if we go over the page, or rather 2 pages, I think, page 328, if we look at the hypothesis, and it's just that first paragraph. And again, just take your time and read that first paragraph and indicate to me once you have.
Is it okay if I read the whole section?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. If you want to scroll down, tell us, but if I help you, Mr. Redfern, I'm going to take you down and show you some bits in the communication section.
Yes, so I've read it now.
That's helpful, thank you. Now, as I say, I'm still just interested in the first paragraph. The M. coloni patients have had contact with unfiltered water. It has built up in the water system as it takes years for biofilm to be created. We possibly don't need to take it any further than that. What is it that you understood or understand now was being communicated in this hypothesis?
That the patient had contact with unfiltered water and therefore was at risk from what the water, or how the water was presenting, I suppose.
And did you say the patient or the patients?
I can't recall whether it was patient or patients, but I would assume it says patients, so I assume it's both.
Yeah. I think, yeah. If we go down the page to the foot of the page, now I'll help you a bit here. The redacted section is about the 2019 patient. And one thing I can tell you without any concern about the patient confidentiality aspects is that it indicates that Professor Gibson is going to be speaking to that patient's family the next day. The bottom part in which you're mentioned, if you take a moment to look at that and indicate once you've done that.
Yes.
Now, if we just take this in stages, and then I will ask you just to give us your recollection of anything else at this stage that you consider pertinent. Can you confirm whether that indicates that you'll be speaking with the 2018 family?
It does.
Can you say whether it indicates the bit about a process and how we contact the first patient's family? What do we take from that?
I think what we were, from my perspective, was that I've described the unhappiness that that parent had in terms of how the hospital was perceived to be handling it, and that he had indicated that that unhappiness could lead to us not carrying out investigation that might prevent a second case, and we now had a second case. I think that's what the summary of position was, and that was how we would be looking at how we would communicate the circumstances of that to that parent.
Can you confirm whether at this point you understood during the IMT that you were to be speaking with the
My understanding was that I would have given the trigger point of when it was the right time to speak to said parent was I would speak to him, yes.
Sorry, just so I understand that, are you saying, can you confirm?
So there had to be a sequence of events, so we had to make sure that the second patient was aware of, following duty of candour through the IMT process, and then as a result of that, we would speak to the first patient. And there's a degree of confidentiality within all of that. But my understanding was that following the IMT's natural process for the second patient, there would be a discussion with the first patient.
Okay. So
parents.
Sorry, on you go.
Parents, I meant discussion with parents.
Can you say whether, just to be clear, we understand your evidence on this, can you say whether, or are you indicating to us therefore that the instruction at the time of the IMT was or was not for you to proceed now to speak with the first patient's father?
I don't think I'd been given the go-ahead to do it, but that the implication was that Dr. Inkster and I would speak to him.
Okay. Now, the next thing I want to look at is some correspondence from that day. And if we go back to bundle 8, and if we go please to page 73. And we've got an email from Sandra Devine to Jennifer Armstrong on the 25th of June 2019. Do you see that?
Yes.
And if we go over the page, please, to page 74. And if we enlarge the section underneath M. Coloni, it says clinical team or women and children's senior management team, would that be? You see it?
Yes.
Will speak to the families of both cases tomorrow. See that?
Yes.
So would that indicate that Sandra Devine's understanding was that on the day after the IMT, there was indeed going to be a discussion with the first patient's family?
I think that's what it says, yeah, and I would expect that to happen. My understanding was that there would be a formal discussion with both parents, patient 2 first, patient 1 second.
But just on the particular observation by Sandra Devine that she expected both of these conversations to happen on the following day, can you say whether that is or is not the same as what you understood to have been said at the IMT of the 25th of June?
I can't remember the specifics of what the timeline would be in terms of what day it was going to be, but it would be relatively one straight after the other. Yeah.
That's helpful. So your expectation would be that...
I was never of the understanding that we would ever not speak to patient one.
Yeah.
Parent one, sorry.
Your understanding was once parent two is told, parent one can be told.
And I've articulated that to said parent of parent one.
And just so we're clear, are you saying that as you saw it at that time in relation to both patients, there was an engaged duty of candour obligation to say something?
That would be my position.
Yeah. And thinking about what we saw in the IMTs and the reference to duty of candour, was it your understanding that that's how the IMT saw it as well?
Yes.
Now, if we turn then to the next day, which is the 26th of June 2019, you can put that to one side, the document to one side. Thank you. Now, we've had evidence in the inquiry already from one of the parents of the second patient, and the evidence that she gave would fit with a meeting with Professor Gibson around that day. And she says that in her evidence that she was advised about the nature of the infection, its rarity, and the need to investigate treatment options. Okay? Now, so we're absolutely clear. I don't think I took her to say that she was told at that point about the cause of the infection.
I don't know, I wasn't part of it.
No, I know that. It's just, I just want you to be sure you understand. That is my understanding of the timeline on the second patient. That there was a conversation that fits with it being about the 26th of June. And according to the patient's parent, the content is as I've described. Now, the evidence of Professor Cudahy is that there was no similar conversation with him or his family at that point. And is that your understanding?
No, I never spoke to Professor Cudahy about it, as indicated in the previous iterations. You've said I never had that.
Yeah.
As we'll come on to later, I never had that conversation with him.
I will give you the opportunity, Mr. Redfern. I promise to let you give your explanation of all of this, but the timeline is tricky and needs to be nailed down. So your position is certainly, at least as regards the 26th of June, you yourself haven't had any conversation.
No.
And do you know whether anybody else had had such a conversation?
My understanding was, sorry, I think I'm still doing what you don't want me to do, but my understanding was that as it became apparent in a further meeting with parent one, that somebody else was going to have that conversation.
And we'll come on to that. Let's just try and take this day by day. No, it's difficult. So if we go back to if we stay on bundle 8 and we go to page 80. And as ever with emails, it's never easy. So if I ask you to go, please, I don't know if your lordship has that in front of him, but it's page 80. At the very foot of the page, we see from Jamie Redfern.
Yes.
And if we then go to page 81, I'll just ask you to, I assume you agree that seems to be an email from you to Mr. Hill and Mr. Dell, is that right?
It looks like that, yes.
Thank you. Now, I've got two questions, one of which is self-evident. we see you telling Mr. Hill that family number one has to be urgently notified. Is that right? Or urgently dealt with?
Yeah, I would never like the situation where a family is in a position where they don't feel that they are being informed of the appropriate information that they think they should have. And we should, if we feel that that is a risk, and that is part of the job I had, which was to test the temperament of whether or not we were experiencing such risks as that, then we should deal with it.
Uh-huh. And we don't need to go too much, I think, into what is said in the paragraph, but it's certainly obvious from it that you certainly were aware that the second family had now been told. Is that right?
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
Yeah. And
so the delay of speaking to the first, sorry, it's tricky. The delay of speaking to the second family, the longer the delay in not speaking to the first family, to my view, is a risk.
yeah, I think if we look at if we take the sentence, I was also informed that the parent immediately following the meeting with Professor Gibson and Teresa, just stop there. Would it be fair to say that you understood by this point that the second family had had their meeting with Professor Gibson?
I think so.
Yeah,
that's what that's saying.
And thus would be aware of the infection in the second patient's case, yeah?
Yes.
And this is you saying to Mr. Hill, we need to deal urgently with the first family.
That's what it says.
Yeah. Now, there's a reference to an email earlier today, and that's not one I've identified in the bundle. And I'm just wondering whether there might be other email correspondence involving you that might help us understand what was going on here. Can you help us with that?
Sorry, presenting emails to you?
No, hold on. It just says, so we need to urgently deal with this family, noting my email earlier today. Do you see that?
Oh, yeah. So that's saying that I mean, it basically said I've sent an email earlier.
Mm-hmm. Prior to giving your evidence today, have you had a look at correspondence from this time to help refresh your memory?
Yeah, but I have, but I'm clear in my mind of what the key events were around this. I've maybe not specifically went into I haven't went into the forensic level of hour by hour, day by day, what you've said, but I do know that the fundamentals around this and what I had expected to be achieved and what was carried out and where the concerns from Professor Cudahy came from.
Are you able to say what it was that you'd noted in your email from earlier in the day?
That the risk of my general position would have been that the risk of not carrying out functioning IMT and the longer we did not do it was creating a problem for us.
Are we to understand that you had a concern that it wasn't being pushed on quickly enough?
I have a concern that the parent had a concern and it was being articulated to me, and that it was a situation that I wanted to try and resolve so that we didn't have that concern and that the parent was fully informed.
Okay, thank you. Now, if we go to bundle 1 again, please. It's page 330. An IMT of the 3rd of July 2019, and you're not recorded.
I was on holiday.
Yeah.
Which I think is pertinent to this whole bit of episode.
And I will ask you about that in a moment, I promise. The evidence that we've had from Professor Cudahy is that up until this point, again, just working through the timeline, up until this point, he still hadn't had a notification from the organisation about the second infection. Would that be your understanding?
Yes. Well, I was on holiday, so I don't know what was going on while I was on holiday, but and sorry, I'm jumping ahead
Yeah, I'll come
again,
to that.
but by what he described to me at that time, then in reflection back, yeah, he hadn't been informed of it.
Yeah. So if we look, please, at the IMT of the 3rd of July, and although you weren't there, is this an IMT that you've had cause to look at subsequently?
Yes, I have.
Yeah. So if we go, please, to page 331. And go to the foot of the page. We see Doctor, well, do you want to just read the paragraph?
The
Water samples one.
Yes.
Now, mindful of what you said about not being a microbiologist, and I have the same issue, obviously. I'd just be interested to know whether you yourself have made any investigations about what that paragraph should be taken to mean.
I haven't spoken to Dr. Inkster about it specifically, but what I would suggest that is saying is that she's still carrying out piping or other investigations around the infection, and every bit of information she gets will help present the picture, but that she is classifying this as an environmental infection.
Yeah.
HEI. So she is saying, as part of the IMT process, this patient is classified as an HEI. I think that's pretty explicit.
Okay, thank you. And if we go over the page, please, to page 332, and if we go to the foot of the page, hypothesis, and obviously I'm only interested in the M. coloni cases. The M. coloni cases, the group is working on the assumption that it is due to patients / staff having access to unfiltered water throughout different areas of the hospital. And can you confirm whether it's your understanding that the use of the plural is deliberate, i.e. that this referred to the 2018 and the 2019?
I think at that time in the IMT we were talking about the two cases.
Yeah.
Although I think this is the IMT that I was on holiday, but I think that's what we were what they would be doing.
Okay. So if we then go over the page, please, to page 333. And if we go under communications, public, we see duty of candour. Prof. Gibson, speaking to the most recent M. coloni patient parents on Tuesday, the chairman of NHSGG&C is in communication with the father of the first case. You see that?
Yes.
Now, if we take the second patient, the 2019 patient, as I've said, the evidence we've got, and confirmed by your email, I think, indicates there has already been one conversation with the second patient's parent about there having been an infection. That's that right?
Yes. Yes.
So there's now to be a further conversation?
Yes.
And that's in the context of duty of candour, is that right?
Well, it's under duty of candour, and I never took the minute and I wasn't at the meeting, but that's what it's there as.
Yeah. And again, I will, it may or may not assist. This IMT took place on a Wednesday, and so it's indicating that on the Tuesday of the following week, so Tuesday the 9th of July, the second patient is going to have a discussion with Professor Gibson. Is that what you would take from that?
Yes.
Yeah.
As part of the IMT process, and as a child having an infection, and what we've described as at that time now with duty of candour as new legislation that had come into force, then the doctor of the patient would explain the whole process around the infection that would meet the principles of duty of candour.
Yeah.
And I think Professor Gibson, although you've mentioned that, that they're, they had said they didn't, the reason for infection hadn't been described. I don't want to contradict him, I wasn't that, but Professor Gibson, from my experience, always follows duty of candour to the letter of the law.
Yeah, and as I've made clear previously, there is no question of any clinician in this inquiry, certainly as far as I'm concerned, being under the microscope as far as their clinical conversations are concerned. But just on that point, the further evidence of the second patient's parent is that there was indeed a second conversation with Professor Gibson in which Professor Gibson indicated that the infection was understood to have come from the theatres in the RHC.
I think that's what has been described in the minutes, and I think that would follow the duty of candour process.
Okay, so that's the 2019 patient. Now, still looking at the duty of candour section in this IMT minute. And if we can just confine ourselves to this stage of things, what would you understand the bit about the first case to indicate in relation to the duty of candour?
That the first parent should be spoken to, and in a similar context to what we've just described, the principles of duty of candour.
So you would take it to indicate that there's to be a similar conversation?
I would have felt entirely comfortable in the scenario that was presenting that the first parent had an experience of being unhappy about how his child had been treated through the IMT process and investigations carried out. He had indicated that there could be a second or further cases, and that we had been presented through an IMT process with a second case, and that Professor Dr. Igster had indicated that two cases were, they were what she described them as. I can't remember her specific words, but was worth further investigation. And on the basis of that, we would notify both parents. We would be notifying both parents. That's my understanding of the circumstances.
And I think we saw...
Still my understanding of the circumstances.
Sorry. Yeah. And I think, as we've seen in this IMT, at least by this stage, I think Dr. Inkster's hypothesis was that there was a connection to unfiltered water. Is that right? In both cases?
I cannot recall what she was referred to with the first case, but certainly in the second case, she's clear about that. But as you say, the word patience is used, so I assume she's relating to both.
Yeah, thank you. So, staying then with this duty of candour section of the IMT, you've indicated that there is to be a communication of that sort with Professor Cudahy. Is there anything on this that indicates to you who it is that's to do that?
Well, under the minute it says duty of candour, the chairman of NHS Greater Glasgow Clyde is in communication with the father of the first case. Whether that is devolved to somebody else while I was on holiday, I don't know.
Is that something that you have investigated?
I have asked, since the events, no, at the time, as we're going to explain the sequence of events, I asked for explanation at that time.
And do you know whether or not the position at the IMT was that the chairman was to handle the duty of candour communication?
I don't know whether it was, as I said, the direct responsibility of the chairman would do that, or whether it was devolved via the chairman to somebody else. I don't know the answer to that.
And I mean, obviously, we've got to proceed with some care here because, as I say, I absolutely acknowledge that I will not have all of the correspondence or reports that bear on this. But you have indicated that you've made some investigation.
There was a sequence of events that prompted me to do it through my own personal sort of professionalism.
And was one of the things that you investigated the question of whether or not it was for the chairman personally or for the chairman to delegate?
No, I didn't ask specifically for, it was a more general position around the situation and events unfolded as.
Okay, well, we might come back to that. But certainly, the evidence of Professor Cudahy is that there was no equivalent conversation to the one I've just described as having happened with the second parent. And would that accord with your own understanding?
Yeah, because I had correspondence with Professor Cudahy thereafter, which he clearly illustrated that.
Now, the evidence before the inquiry is that on the following day, there was a letter from the chairman to Professor Cudahy in which the chairman discussed with Professor Cudahy aspects of his daughter's case, but said nothing about the further case. Is that a piece of correspondence that you're aware of or have seen?
No, not that I'm aware of.
Are you indicating that you're not even aware that such correspondence happened?
I'm aware there was correspondence between the chairman and Professor Cudahy, and I'm aware that there have been meetings since then with other key senior officers with Professor Cudahy and members of the exec team. I wasn't part of those meetings.
So just thinking about where we've got to in the timeline, your understanding is that the duty of candour, communication, and please say if I am not understanding your evidence, the duty of candour obligation sits with the chairman or will be delegated to the chairman to somebody else.
That's what my understanding of the minutes says, but I wasn't at the meeting, so I don't know the context of the conversation. What I am clear about is prior to going on holiday, there needed to be a conversation with parent one.
Yeah, and we saw your email emphasising that to Mr. Hill, is that right?
So I don't deviate from that whatsoever. It is who has that conversation, and at that time I went on holiday. And that is my knowledge of that particular time of events. And I can pick up when we get to it of when I came back from holiday and what happened thereafter.
I'll do that with you in a minute. We're just about
I know I'm desperate to get to that, but I think it explains the situation.
We're nearly there, I promise you. But we're quite anxious to get a timeline. So if you'll forgive me,
sorry.
I'll keep proceeding in that way. Now, the evidence that we've had, Mr. Redfern, and I appreciate, especially as you're on holiday, you may not have known about this. The evidence that we've had around this time, and this is evidence from Professor Cudahy and his daughter, is that around this time in a clinic with Dr. Sastry, Dr. Sastry mentioned that there had been this further infection.
Yeah, I was aware of that.
And something else that no doubt you're aware of is that he then, as he put it in his evidence, he waited for a spell because he assumed that there would be a communication about this, and then eventually he wrote to you in pretty strong terms. Is that fair?
Yes, that's correct.
And again, you've indicated that you have made some investigations into this matter. Are we right in understanding that? So let's take a step back. The email he sent to you.
I was extremely upset by that email.
Yeah, as he put it in his evidence, he didn't miss and hit the wall on it.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I found it very unfair to me personally, and that was a conversation I had with Mr. Hill.
And we'll come to that in a minute. Are we right in understanding that from from the investigations that you made that there had still been no communication, official communication by the organisation by this stage?
No, that's not entirely correct. What timeline are we on? Am I back from holiday?
At the point that Mr. Cudahy wrote to you on the 17th.
Right, so I'm back from holiday then.
So in the period when you're on holiday, in other words,
When I came back from holiday, the first thing I did was say, "Is this situation sorted?" And and part of why I did that was because I earlier, before going on holiday, was told that I was to speak to Professor Cudahy, which came out in the meeting with him later on, which I'm sure you'll get to. As a result of that, I was keen to know that the matter was resolved. I was told the matter was resolved by Mr. Hill and that I took no further action, and then and I had no reason to doubt Mr. Hill. I then got the email that he didn't miss me, as you say, from Professor Cudahy, and picked up thereafter with Mr. Hill and subsequently Mr. Best.
thank you. Now that's helpful because it helps us with the timeline. You indicated an instruction from Mr. Hill not to speak to.
Told me it was being dealt with through other aspects of the organisation.
And are you indicating to us that that was an instruction that took place before you went on holiday?
Yes.
And
it was, I mean, these events were all right on the cusp of holiday, but it was, it was not referred to me that it would be a deviation of what the IMT had requested. It was just who was doing it, and I was told not to do it, and I asked Dr. Inkster, of which I did.
And can you remember how was he told you this? Was it in a
informal conversation?
And was that at an IMT?
No.
Was it immediately after an IMT?
I can't remember. It would have been round about all these things. I think it was part of a formal management meeting within Women and Children's, if I remember.
Sorry. And what was it he said?
If my memory was, it would be a formal MDMT within Women and Children's, that we would be talking about an update in infection control, and as a result of an update in infection control, we would come on to Ward 2A, and that we were having a conversation around the implications of the IMT and the actions that we were following through, one of which was that we had this situation of the two cases, and that out with that discussion, I was told that request to carry that particular action out was being taken forward by others and I hadn't to do it. And I said, fine, I'm going on holiday the next day or whenever it was, that's fine, I'll leave it. And when I came back from holiday, as I said, I asked, is the matter dealt with? And was told yes. So I never took any further action with Professor Cudahy on this.
And did
I never asked for any formal investigation of it or saw evidence of that. I didn't see that as my place. I would take people at face value as part of that process.
Yeah. And did Professor Cudahy's email that we've just been speaking about, the fairly direct email, did that arrive after you'd been told that it had been dealt with?
Yes.
Yeah. So who was it you had the conversation with about whether it had been dealt with?
Kevin, Mr. Hill.
And can you remember, was that in a formal meeting or was it in passing?
No, that was just me inquiring as coming back from holiday, saying I've read the minute of the meetings, there's actions to be taken. Is this situation being dealt with? Because I've expressed in previous emails that you've brought up and showed that there was concern around how we were handling this, and that I was told it was sorted.
And were you told how it had been sorted?
No, I just was told it was sorted and I didn't need to do anything. I dropped the matter.
Were you told, well, if I just pursue this a little, were you told who had sorted it?
No, I just assumed that it was dealt with corporately.
And were you told what had been said?
No.
Okay. And so you then received Professor Cudahy's email?
Yes.
And what investigation did you make after you'd received the email?
I went straight to Mr. Hill and showed him the email and said, how am I going to respond to this? This is extremely unfair. I've been put in a really difficult position and I'm not happy about it because of the two events that I've just described. And I was told that I would then meet with Professor Cudahy. An email was drafted to invite him to the meeting, of which Dr. Inkster and I would do it. And we had that meeting.
And we're going to look at an email before you had the meeting, you sent an email to Professor Cudahy, which set out the explanation as you understood it, and we'll look at that in a minute. But what I'm interested in, before we get to that, is what was it that Mr. Hill offered by way of explanation as regards how this had happened?
He never really gave me an explanation.
Did you?
And I remained extremely unhappy right through this whole process that I was put in this position. That is something that I've expressed to Mr. Hill, to Mr. Best before. But
what I'm interested in particular is, I mean, we've seen that you were anxious that this thing was moved on. And we've seen, as you said, that you were the point of contact, in fact, going back into 2018, and you've agreed that there had been warnings from Professor Cudahy. So it's obvious that you, even before you went on holiday, you had some concerns.
So I work on the basis, and this is part of the job I see as my job, which is that there are actions within an IMT that have to be followed through. And if they are under the responsibility of me, then I want to make sure those actions are followed through timeously and correctly. And coming back from that, there was an action of the IMT that I felt was the responsibility of a combination between the consultant, Dr. Inkster and myself, to clarify situation with Professor Cudahy, and I was told that it had been dealt with. The action was closed.
Well, what we saw was that the duty of candour obligation referred to the chairman, and what you've said is you don't know whether it was him personally or.
Well, I don't know whether he personally. That's what I'm saying. I've never had a conversation with the chairman on this.
Yeah, but just, I mean, before we look at the email to Professor Cudahy, I'm just thinking about the exchange that you had with Mr. Hill when you came back from your holiday, or rather when you received Professor Cudahy's angry email. Did you ask Mr. Hill on what basis he told you that this was sorted?
On the basis that a communication had been exchanged with Professor Cudahy and that explanation had been given and the action of the IMT was concluded.
That's what he said to you before. Sorry, Mr. Redfern. That's what Mr. Hill had said to you before you got Professor Cudahy's email. Is that right?
Yes.
So after you got the email, and as you say, you were unhappy, and you went to see Mr. Hill, presumably you would ask him, "Why did you tell me this was sorted?"
I did, and I never, as I've said, I never got a formal response contrary to that. I just got an instruction to meet with.
Sorry, if you don't mind me interrupting, that's not what I'm asking you. Did you ask him why it was he had previously said it was sorted when, upon receipt of Professor Cudahy's email, it was obvious that it wasn't?
I think my conversation with Mr. Hill at the time was, I thought we had said this was sorted. How am I going to respond to this? I'm extremely unhappy with it. And that was the process we followed thereafter.
But you said that Mr. Hill had told you before it is sorted, yeah?
Yes.
And it's obvious that it wasn't. So you would ask him, presumably, why? No, hold on. You would ask him, presumably, why did you tell me it was sorted? Did you ask him that question?
As I said, yeah, because I was wanting to know how I was going to handle it.
So did he explain the basis upon which he had told you it was sorted?
He said it had been dealt with corporately.
But obviously...
I didn't ask for the exchange of communication, the date of the meeting. I didn't ask for any specifics around that.
But at the time of Professor Cudahy's email and this further conversation with Mr. Hill, it's obvious it hasn't been dealt with corporately. Is that right? So did you ask him why it was he previously told you that it had been?
No.
You didn't ask him?
No, I was more interested in the time of how I was going to handle the situation with Professor Cuddihy.
Were you annoyed with Mr. Hill?
I was annoyed with, yeah.
So, but you didn't ask him how this all happened?
I can't remember everything that I had with Mr. Hill. It was more about how I was going to handle the situation with Professor Cuddihy in response to his email.
Okay. If we move on then, please, I want to, my lord, I'm conscious of the time. I think I could probably conclude this chapter within half an hour or so, but it's a matter for your lordship.
How are you doing, Mr.
I'm fine.
You quite content? I'm not seeing any dissent. Carry on.
Thank you, my lord. Now, if we go to your email of the 25th of July 2019, which is at page 58 of bundle 6. So I'm assuming, as we've been speaking about this email quite a bit, this is the email in which you set out the explanation to Professor Cuddihy, is that right?
Yes.
As you understood it, is that right?
Yes.
So I've discussed with senior colleagues and can now provide an update. Who were the senior colleagues?
Mr. Best, Mr. Hill, and to a certain extent, Dr. Alan Mathers, Chief of Medicine.
Okay. And then in the next paragraph, you say, we believe that we have been open about what we have known and what we have been seeking clarification and scientific data on. However, we acknowledge that this may have complicated, effective and timely communication, but this should not be misconstrued as obfuscation on our part. Both myself and Dr. Inkster have been on annual leave, and this has been a further factor. You say, I don't agree with your suggestion that there has been any cover-up, but you then go on to say at the foot of the page, you can scroll down, yep, there was clearly an action to update you. Yeah?
Yes.
And it says, it's important to be clear that whoever is nominated to carry out this action and when it takes place is at the instruction of the chair. Now, pausing there, I think we've agreed that the IMTs indicate that the settled position of the most recent pertinent IMT was that there had to be a duty of candour communication to Professor Cuddihy. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. Normally this action would be undertaken by Dr. Inkster and or myself. And then you say there are mitigating circumstances that need to be considered when reviewing how this action has been progressed. First, as we were waiting on some bacteriological typing results pertinent to what we might say in such discussion with you and your family. Next, as we needed to be very careful around patient confidentiality. And then there's the reference to not wanting to cross the ongoing communication with our chairman. You see all of that?
Yes.
Now, how was it you came by those 3 bullet points? Was that from your investigations with your senior colleagues?
Yes.
Now, thinking back to the IMT that we looked at, do any of those appear there? Was there any indication that the duty of candour communication would be postponed until typing results were obtained?
No, not at the time of the IMT.
Yeah. And as regards patient confidentiality, as I've indicated to you, there had already been one communication with the second patient's parent, and there was a second one, according to the parent, very soon after the IMT. So can you help me with why that's an explanation for why by the time you got back from holiday, there still hadn't been a communication to...
I can't tell you why there was the sequence of events that came thereafter, which were that the Professor Cudahy was prompted to write his email and how we get into that position.
That's helpful, Mr. Redfern. I think essentially you're setting out what you'd been told the explanation was, is that right?
Yes.
Yeah, and if we take the first one, waiting for typing results, the evidence you've already given is that the IMT had decided that although there was further investigation going on in relation to typing, it was time to move on with duty of candour discussions, is that right?
Yes.
Yeah, so that can't be, well, that's difficult to square those two things, is that right?
I think what we were trying to say, there was a whole set of circumstances around why we might have came in the position that we found ourselves in.
Okay, I'm just trying to take them one by one, and I think I'm taking you to indicate that the first explanation is not consistent with what I took you to be saying as regards the settled position of the IMT. Is that right?
The emails suggest that there would have been a conversation, and the IMT was comfortable with the instruction that there should be a conversation with Professor Cudahy.
Yeah, and on the second one, patient confidentiality, if it was the position that by early July there had been two conversations with the parent of the second patient, at least by the time of the second discussion, confidentiality couldn't have been an explanation. Is that fair?
Yes, I would say that's fair.
So the only bit that I think we can see that links back to the IMT is a reference to a communication with the chairman. Is that right?
That's what it says, yeah.
And can you say whether, thinking about the evidence you've already given, did you know any more than that about what the ongoing communication was with the chairman?
Just that Professor Cudahy was extremely unhappy about the whole situation around the infections and the safety of the campus and how the board was managing that.
Okay. Now, if we're moving finally towards the meeting, and just about there, there's really just three bits of this that I want to look at, with the meeting being the second one. There's just one more bit of the timeline that I want to just make sure that we've all got. And if we go to the IMT on the 1st of August, which is in Bundle 1, Mrs. Soshkut's page 334. And I just want to go, this is one I think that you're present at, is that right?
No, I don't think I'm present on the 1st of August.
No, I'm sorry, I do apologise. What I wanted you to help me with is, in page 337, sorry. Underneath duty of candour, if we scroll down, this will be covered under the communications meeting tomorrow morning. You know what that was?
I have no idea.
Okay, thank you. Now, finally, you have a meeting with Professor Cudahy and Dr. Inkster, is that right?
Yes.
And now, for my purposes, I have covered off all of the bits of the timeline that I feel are pertinent. But you must feel that you've had the opportunity to tell your story of what happened at that meeting, if that's what you want to do. There's only one bit of it that I want to ask you about, and it's a further concern that Professor Cudahy had raised. And he said in his evidence that he had asked you to, well, let me take a step back. Is it correct that at the meeting that the better way to do this is you tell me what you want to tell me about the meeting.
Well, I'll just describe what happened at the meeting. The purpose of the meeting, I wanted the purpose of the meeting to explain the sequence of events that you have went through. I wanted to clarify any issues around duty candour if there were still things outstanding. I wanted to apologise for the delay in the timeline of obviously what had happened, because Professor Cudahy's view of the meeting not his view of the meeting, his experience or position was, as articulated in his email, that he had given me time to contact him as part of the duty candour process, and that had not happened. Therefore, he had prompted it by the email he sent. So I wanted to go through all of that with him. But most of all, I wanted him to be clear that we were explaining everything that had happened between the two cases. So I can't go back in time in terms of what the timeline it is taking to get us to this point. But that's what I wanted to do. That was what I really wanted out of the meeting. However, in trying to describe how we had got to this delay in timeline, Dr. Inkster broke into conversation and said, "We were told not to speak to you." And Professor Cudahy got extremely upset in the meeting and basically stopped the meeting and said he was taking it up with the senior corporate management team. And that, frankly, was probably the last involvement from recollection I had in this, except updating Mr. Hill. That was the outcome of the meeting.
I don't know what Dr. Inkster's position on the meeting is, and I don't know.
She was there as normally what we would do around duty candour and what would have probably happened normally under the IMT if we'd followed the instruction at the time.
But we've not had her evidence, is what I mean. But we have had the evidence of Professor Cudahy, and I don't think we need to take up a huge amount of time on this. But I think his recollection was that you started offering an explanation, and she said something along the lines, or Dr. Inkster said something along the lines of, "Tell Professor Cudahy the truth, Jamie." Do you remember her saying anything like that?
It may have been those words. I don't think I was telling lies.
I think I
wouldn't go into a meeting to tell lies.
And I think one of the other important aspects of this was that I think Professor Cudahy's recollection was that he asked you, and I think Dr. Inkster, to say who it was had given the instruction not to speak to him, and his recollection was that you weren't prepared to do so.
I can't remember that. If I did do that, I'm not sure why I did that.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
I've no reason to dispute Professor Cudahy's version of account of that meeting. It was a very challenging meeting. It was incredibly difficult, and it did not go the way that I had hoped it would go.
And there's just one further bit of the jigsaw, as known to me, at least. There may be other documents that I'm not aware of about all of this, but we know from the correspondence that we've got, and I won't take up too much time on this, that Professor Cudahy wrote to the chairman and ultimately to the chief executive. And I don't know whether you know this, but in his correspondence, he ultimately came to say that he believed that you had acted in good faith, and he was concerned about the instruction that you'd had. Is that something that you were aware of?
I don't know about the letter. I haven't been shown the letter. I have a good relationship with Professor Cudahy, and we have briefly discussed that as part of that. He did indicate in the meeting that he thought I was under pressure. I think that came retrospectively after it. And I am glad that he said at the time that I was always acting in good faith, because that's always what I would be expecting to do.
He, in his evidence to us, he said that he had been very concerned about you at the meeting.
It was not an easy meeting.
Now, if we move on then to a response that we're aware of, I don't know whether there are others, but our response that we're aware of from the Chief Executive to Professor Cudahy's concerns, and this is probably the last thing we'll have time to look at today, but it more or less concludes this chapter. It's bundle 6 at page 75, please, Mrs. Soshka. And this is a letter of the 27th of September 2019 to Professor Cudahy from the Chief Executive. Can you say whether this is something that you've ever seen before?
I don't think so.
I'll just draw something to your attention then. Could we enlarge the paragraph that begins during June and July 2019? And once again, Mr. Redfern, could you take a moment to read it, please, and just tell me once you've done that?
Yes.
And does that appear, if we focus on the second half of the paragraph, it says, it was felt that communication with you regarding this should wait until such time that the typing results of the second child's bacteria were available, and hence an understanding of any linkage to Molly's bacterial typing could be excluded. If we just pause there, that is, I suppose, similar to one of the explanations in your email, is that right?
Yes.
But the typing that's being referred to seems to be the typing of the two patient samples, is that right?
Yes.
Do you know why that would assist in understanding whether or not either of those samples was connected to the water supply?
No, I don't know the answer to that question.
Okay. And
what I do, and I suppose this would be a conversation with Dr. Inkster, was whether or not the relevance of the fact that the two cases were ultimately found not to be related impacted on her observations that she made at the IMT, and I don't know the answer to that.
Okay. And the other matter was patient confidentiality, which we've spoken about already, and I think I took you to agree that at least as far as the period from early July until your return from holiday, that doesn't seem to be an explanation. Is that fair?
There was a sequence of events around confidentiality, but the timelines possibly don't fit.
And the third thing that was in your email, which is about not cutting across chairman's communications, that doesn't seem to be mentioned. Is that right?
I can't comment for the construct to this letter. I don't know.
Okay.
Well, it's not from the paragraph you've read. You've highlighted it's not there.
Okay. And we've now gone through the timeline and you've had the opportunity to give your own reflections on this. Are there any bits of the timeline that you've investigated and that we've not uncovered? And
no, I think the only point I would make again is, and I hope this doesn't come across as a contradiction, is that through the IMT process and thereafter there was always an intention to speak to whether it was Professor Cudahy or another parent, and that was clearly articulated in the IMT process and should have been followed through. The timeline with this particular case obviously has a delay in that, of which we've been through all of that. But I would again stress that there was transparency and that this is something that should happen and ultimately was my intention would happen.
Sorry, to be clear, you would describe the process that we've just looked at as one that is transparent?
No, I'm saying that an IMT process should always be transparent, and that was my intention at the end when we were meeting with Professor Cudahy, that we'd be able to explain that. Whether or not your view of this whole process is transparent, I suppose, is open to interpretation.
Well, it's really your view I'm interested in. Are you Can you say
I
whether
think there was an unfortunate delay in the timeline of speaking to Professor
you,
Cuddihy.
you were the one that raised the word
Sorry.
transparency?
Sorry, I was trying to articulate that in good faith at all times. I would hope that we would always speak openly and truthfully to parents, and that is the background of everything within NHS Greater Glasgow Clyde I've found.
Well, I'm just thinking about, as I say, you were the one that raised the issue of transparency. Considering the timeline, I'm not looking at you as an individual, but just thinking about the timeline we've just looked at, do you consider that the communication, insofar as we know about it, it could be described as being transparent in the case of the Cuddahys?
I think that the communication could have been better. Yeah, I was talking about the interpretation of where we were going as an organisation, and that there was an openness that this had to happen.
Okay, just a few more questions on, just to wrap this up, and it's just really a postscript. And you may or may not be able to help us with this. It's just to help us get this into our understanding of the narrative. In terms of other evidence that we've heard, and in particular evidence from Professor Cuddihy, are you aware of whether there were, in addition to these two cases, any other cases of Mycobacterium coloni affecting paediatric patients in the hospital?
I can't remember.
Do you know whether there were, for example, in the case note review, which I assume you've heard of?
Yes.
Do you know whether or not there's a suggestion of 3 paediatric patients having had Mycobacterium coloni?
I can't comment on that. I would need to go back and look.
And you don't know whether and what investigations have been made around that?
No, I don't know.
And the final matter on this point is Professor Cuddihy also indicated in his evidence that during the case note review process, he discovered, or he learned, that in April 2019, there had been testing done in Ward 2A, including in a room that his daughter had been in the year before, and that had identified Mycobacterium coloni in the water supply. Is that something that you're aware of?
No.
Okay.
And I was not privy to the case review, individual cases and reports.
Thank you, Mr. Redfern. My Lord, I do still have some way to go, unfortunately. I can't imagine it would be more than an hour, but we're at 4:30 already.
No, I don't think it's practical to continue. There's a point at which it really becomes difficult to take in information. Mr. Redfern, can you come back tomorrow?
Yes.
And we'll complete your evidence then. I'll ask Mrs. Brown to take you to the witness room.
Thank you.
See you tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock.
Okay.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we'll see each other tomorrow at 10. I think the original schedule had indicated that was it Dr. Hart would be giving evidence tomorrow. Now, what's your position on that, Ms. Duncan?
We're not going to be asking Dr. Hart to give oral evidence at this point. We're going to seek a supplementary statement from him on 1 or 2 points, and we will revisit matters in the future if we consider that's appropriate. And just on the subject of witnesses, Mr. Murray, who was down to give evidence on Thursday, is in the same category. We may want to revisit his evidence and oral evidence in the future, but at this point we're going to seek some supplementary evidence from him by way of statement.
Very well. Well, we'll see each other tomorrow at 10.
Please stand.